Hi, this is Boki, and today I am back from vacation. I am like back to the colors that I used to be when I lived in California and wasn't just like, you know, in lab and like Boston weather all the time. So it was a good vacation, but now I am back and able to make videos again. So today I wanted to talk about two books that I read recently, and these are books that like kind of on the surface don't necessarily have that much in common. First is a YA fantasy with like thieves and kings and queens and stuff. The second is a historical romance featuring like divorcees and bars and weird family antics. On the surface, not necessarily books that had a lot in common, but my reading experience of them ended up being very similar. Like I really like these books and I really like these authors, and so when I read it I was really enjoying it for a lot of the things that the authors are great at, but then the things that let me down as far as the story goes were that much more frustrating because I liked it. So on to the two books that I'm talking about. The first is Thieves by Whalen Turner, and the second is The Day of the Duchess by MacLean. If you've watched my channel over the past, you know, however many months, whatever, year, you've probably heard me mention these books at least once, probably a whole bunch of times. They are basically the books that I've been most excited for 2017. These are both authors that I love. These are both series that I love. Thieves is part of Turner's Queen's Thief series, which is a YA fantasy series that I think is like should be talked about so much more. And MacLean is like one of my favorite writers, one of my favorite romance writers. Like every one of her books I'm just always so excited about. So I was super excited for both of these books for this year, and yeah, they both were great in the ways that I'm like familiar with these writers for. The things that I love about these writers, I think that these books totally lived up to. And yet they both built my expectation of subversion in a way. Like I thought they were both going to be doing really interesting things as far as representation goes over the course of the book. And then in like the very last chapter, basically we're like, nope, never mind. We take it back. So this discussion is going to be like mildly spoilery. I'm not going to get too hardcore spoilery, but if you are like waiting to like read one of these books, you might want to skip this discussion for now, but please come back because I want to talk about these books. So Thieves, part of the Queen's Thief series, like I said, a really great series. I think, not to like kind of reach for the convenient comparison, but it is sort of like a Game of Thrones-y kind of series where it's a lot of political intrigue. It's set sort of like an alternative Mediterranean, I guess, and there are like thieves and kings and queens, and it's just an amazing series. Start with a thief, read it. It is so good. Turner is really good at like twists and turns that are just so well built that even if you see them coming, you're so excited to see them like actually happen. So totally recommend the series. And Thieves I was super excited for. I didn't really know what I was getting into because another thing that Turner is really good at is bringing in kind of new characters and new writing styles. And so every book that I've read of hers in the series feels like a different experience. They feel like very different books, but there's like an underlying kind of coherent plot being developed and like ideas, common, I don't know, traits between the books that really creates a coherence that I really love. I think the series is so good. And in this book, we're following basically these two characters who have varying degrees of importance in other books, and they get thrown together on a road trip essentially where they are escaping one country and running off to another. And it has all the fun of like a buddy road trip sort of feel to it. And then it also has moments where it feels very romantic. Like if you've watched any kind of rom-com where two characters get thrown into a road trip together where they're like on the run or whatever, it has a lot of very familiar beats to it where you're like, this is a love story. Like these two people are gonna fall in love. And I was excited because these two characters are male, and like this is a YA fantasy book series that's like won a Newbery Award. The thing is, Turner is really good at writing these really complicated romantic relationships that really take into account the political and like social and interpersonal kind of factors at play. And so I was really excited because I thought this was going to be a great moment for the series to kind of explore that in the context of this relationship. And at the end, basically, this is where we get very, very quickly spoilery. Basically, they are just friends. Like, they are friends who go live together, but they're like those roommates, I guess. And like, maybe it's one of the things that's supposed to just be like, you know, this is just subtext, but like, throughout this book, these two characters, their relationship is constantly analogized to these mythological bros within, you know, the world of the story, where like there's these best bros and one of the bros is constantly saving the other bro from like you know, whatever entanglement he's gotten himself ensnared with due to what some woman. And it's the kind of like mythological story that, you know, if any of us were reading it in a college class, it'd be like a whole section or lecture or whatever just dedicated to arguing about whether or not there's something else going on, like, you know, what kind of homoerotic subtext is at play. And so having the relationship constantly like analogized to these two guys, it felt like kind of constant, like, you know, they're just bros, like they're just bros, like just, you know, they're just bros. But with this weird subtext to it, but not subtext to it, I don't know, it just felt very flat for me. Like it just felt a little bit disappointing because I thought, like I said, that this was going to be a really like interesting relationship built up over the course of the story. And sometimes Turner does carry romantic relationships through multiple books, like they will be hinted at in earlier stories and not really addressed until later books. So maybe I should give this the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it will, like, you know, it will happen in another book. But it would be weird to me if that were the case because this book is so much about their relationship. I'm not sure why you wouldn't just do that in this book. I think if it weren't for that constant feeling of like the book trying to remind you that they're just friends, I might have been slightly less frustrated. Like maybe I could be like, well, you know, I just read a little bit too much into it. But it felt like the book was actively discouraging you from reading too much into it while still also wanting you to read too much into it, if that makes sense. And yet, for all that, like, I'm frustrated with this one element that I've like dedicated so many minutes to talking about. Turner is really good at what she does. She's really good at writing stories with like these twists and turns in it, and this book did not disappoint in that sense. It lived up to my expectations of plot and character, but it's this one element that, because I love so much else about this book, that element stands out so much stronger as being disappointing. And that brings me to The Day of the Duchess by Sarah MacLean, which is a historical romance. It's part of her Scandals and Scoundrels series that I've talked about a million times, probably like all of my like recent romance reading rundowns. I feel like I'm probably talking about one of her books in it. This particular book follows Seraphina, who is a duchess and who is married to a Duke, Malcolm. And they have had an estrangement of sorts. They, early on in their relationship, in their marriage, they had sort of a moment of things not working. And after this sort of happens, Seraphina gets pregnant, but she miscarries, and the doctor tells her that she is infertile. And basically her mother-in-law convinces her that she should leave her husband because he doesn't need an infertile wife. She does run away, but she comes back and basically she wants her independence and she asks for a divorce. So I was super excited about this book because not only is it one of my favorite writers, it was going to be a mending a broken relationship story, which is something that I really enjoy, the angst, I guess. So again, this is where we get slightly spoilery, not super spoilery, but basically romance novels have sort of a happily ever after mandate. And usually what that involves, especially in historical romances, is the characters get married and they have babies. And I thought, you know, well, we have this infertile character. This is actually going to be really interesting. We're going to subvert a lot of those expectations. Like, they'll get married, but they're not going to have all those babies. I really like the idea of not having fertility be connected to a happily ever after, especially for a historical romance series. Infertility is obviously incredibly painful for a lot of families, and especially for a lot of women, where like the psychological and the physical pain associated with it can become eventually a public burden, especially, you know, in a society where women and pregnancy and their bodies are, people kind of decide that that's up for public comment. And in a lot of, you know, books and pop culture, like, infertility is portrayed as an obstacle to personal and, you know, familial happiness. So like in the context of this book, Seraphina, the Duchess, she finds out that she's infertile, and she basically decides, well, like, this relationship is never going to be salvaged now because I'm never going to be able to make my husband happy because I'm infertile. Like, it's an incredibly personal, terrible burden that she has to bear in the context of the story. This carries over into like other things that are, you know, set in modern day. For example, in The Avengers, where Joss Whedon's sort of like obsession with incapacitating powerful women for the sake of illustrating male pain, it becomes manifested in The Black Widow. We find out that her painful, tragic backstory is that she has been put through a forced sterilization, that she's been rendered infertile against her will. And this infertility, this forced sterilization, in the context of the movie is compared to Hulk's Hulkness. Like, that monstrosity that he is compared to what she considers her own internal monstrosity. So infertility, it's just like the portrayals of it can become so complicated even if it's not set in historical context. The thing is, we get to the end of this book and I've had this expectation that I'm really excited about, that like we're gonna have an infertile heroine who's still gonna have a happily ever after. And then it turns out that, like, surprise, the doctor was wrong. She's actually super fertile. Like, she doesn't just have like one kid, she has like 3 or 4, I think. Maybe not, I don't know. She has a bunch of kids, and it was just, again, the same thing as Thick as Thieves, where it was just kind of a letdown. I understand for the time and the place that this book is set in that fertility is important, that it is like an important measurement of like happiness. It's also considered a measure of like a woman's quality, of her contribution to a marriage. But so much of this book is about challenging women's roles. Serafina, like, her whole goal is to be independent and have her own bar. I was really excited for, you know, what I thought was going to be an overall challenging, not just of a woman's role in marriage and in her career, but also, you know, in making babies. And again, like Thick as Thieves, I enjoy this book a lot. I really like Sarah MacLean's writing. I think she has really fun plots. I think she has really fun characters. I love seeing characters that we already knew in this book. I love seeing kind of the setup for future books in this story. But this one element is just, it stands out so much to me. YA and romance are these genres where I feel like, at least for me online, I see a lot of really great conversations from people who write in these genres and people who read these genres. A lot of conversations about representation, about subverting tropes, and I think there's a lot of conversation that is really meaningful both for writers and consumers of these works. I'm trying to figure out to what extent I'm placing unfair expectations on these genres, because both of these books do a lot to subvert a lot of traditional kind of roles for characters in them. And yet, almost because they do try, I'm almost more frustrated by the falling out on those expectations, I guess. But I think the extent to which I feel like I'm being fair is that, at least in the books that I'm talking about, I do feel like the book themselves raised an expectation of this, that I think that they did something throughout the course of the book that was interesting, that really built up the potential for an interesting, subversive plotline that is consistent with the series that they're a part of, and yet then didn't follow through. So I can't tell a writer what to do with their work. Maybe they didn't see it that way, like maybe that's not what they anticipated, but it is the impression that I got as a reader about where their work was going. So I don't know that I have like a definitive question or answer or anything that I'm getting at. All I'm saying is that there are books that you love that sometimes, because you love them, the things that are frustrating about them are that much more frustrating than if they had happened in another book, or if they were written by, you know, somebody else, or if they were part of a different genre. So if you think that I am like being unfair to these authors, if you've read these books and you want to talk more about them, we can talk more down below in the comments on Twitter. I would really love to kind of talk this out. So trying to sort out these feelings. So thank you for watching, and yeah, bye.